In the dim glow of candlelight, nestled within the cozy confines of a Victorian parlour, Death sat as comfortably as any distant relative who had overstayed his welcome. The 19th century was a peculiar time when life expectancy and lace curtains often shared the same length. It was an era when Victorian families invited mortality into their homes, not as an intruder, but rather as that well-mannered guest who always hung around just a little too long, sipping tea in the drawing room while everyone quietly whispered about him. Victorian homes were like peculiar museums of life and death, where the two coexisted in an ornate dance of societal customs and personal farewells. Death wasn't a dress rehearsal, it was part of everyday life. And oh, the Victorians had a flair for making goodbye look like an art form. Mourning attire became the haute couture of the time, with wardrobes dedicated solely to the melancholic fashions of eternal farewell. Black crepe dresses with diminutive jet, beadings that whispered sorrow, yet maintained a stylish flair. Their parlours transformed into viewing rooms, a curious combo of overstuffed chairs, potted ferns, and the dearly departed laid out in peaceful repose, like an unknowing guest at an overly genteel afternoon tea. The drapery would be drawn, and mirrors turned to face the wall, because the ghost of Great-Aunt Mildred might just sneak a peek at her reflection before bidding a final farewell. Family members played mournful ballads on the pianoforte, a kind of soundtrack to sadness that floated through the house with the grace of a slow, waltzing breeze. Friends and neighbours alike shuffled through the riffles of the black-bound Book of Common Prayer, their whispers coiling gently with the aroma of lavender sachets prominent in the air. It was a time when children grew up learning to nod and solemnly observe the etiquette of death almost as soon as they learned their letters. Little faces peered from behind mother's skirt, eyes wide, absorbing the lessons on how to both grieve reverently and pour the perfect cup of tea for a mourning guest. It may sound a morbid syllabus for children, but nestled within it was the understanding of a life continuum, a gentle acceptance of farewells and new beginnings. Against this backdrop, we find our Victorian families keeping company with death on their own terms. Official undertakers coached bereaved families through the labyrinth of customs, offering services with grave-face professionalism and impeccable attention to detail. One might almost envy the refinement with which they administered death's rites, somewhere between an impresario and a funeral director, guiding the living in a last act worthy of silent applause. And yet, despite the mourning paraphernalia, Victorian death customs were not without their touches of ingenuity and unintentional hilarity. Consider the safety coffin, a delightful contraption designed with a built-in bell or escape hatch, should one's exit from life prove to be slightly premature. Such was their fear of being buried alive that some folks opted for this early version of an exit strategy. One can only imagine the neighbours enjoying a morning stroll through a cemetery, only for the silence to be punctured by the cheerful jingling of a safety bell. The Victorians may have taken their solemnity seriously, but even they couldn't escape the whims of happenstance and human oversight. All this pondering might have you curious about what mysteries the adieu rituals of the era still hold. But that's another tale nestled under the cloak of night, waiting for a gentle whisper to awaken its slumber. As your eyes grow heavy with tales of yesteryears and you've one more chapter closer to sweet dreams. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is. There. For now, rest easy in the soft embrace of history's gentle lullaby as we find ourselves drifting gently into the heart of the Victorian household. It's important to note that, much like the peculiar ritual of drinking tea from chintzy porcelain, cohabiting with death was simply part of the daily routine. You see, the Victorians had a flair for embracing the eternal nap with a certain panache, unmatched by modern society, save perhaps for our enthusiasm for binge-watching period dramas. Picture it, a cozy parlour where stiff collars and corsets mingle as freely as Aunt Mildred's giggle-inducing sherry. It's within these walls that the family gathered, not just to discuss the latest fashions or the gossip about Lord Featherbottom's tragically asymmetric mutton chops, but also to treat with death as one would an old, albeit a bit morose, family friend. It was commonplace for families to host grand send-offs within their living rooms. Think of it as an early form of Airbnb, where guests stayed for eternity. The living room, paradoxically named since it often doubled as a temporary resting place for the departed, was draped in heavy curtains, both to mark respect and to cunningly prevent nosy neighbors from peeking in. You see, privacy was of utmost importance, second only perhaps to proper etiquette, which dictated you shouldn't point out if the cucumbers in the sandwiches were slightly wilting. To truly grasp this enigmatic blend of life and death sharing the same space, imagine attending one of these intimate Victorian funerals. Amidst the faint scent of violets and freshly polished mahogany, a small orchestra of clocks might tick melodiously in unison, their pendulums swinging in a gentle waltz, as if whispering a rhythmic tribute to the dearly departed. Guests, adorned in their mourning attire, black being the new black, would engage in a subdued ballet of glances and nods, communicating their condolences with all the solemnity of a tea kettle at full boil. Photographs of the deceased were often displayed with great reverence. This photographic practice, known as memento mori, translates to remember you must die, which the Victorians did quite enthusiastically, considering how often they captured their loved ones post-mortem. These photographs served as a rather uncanny keepsake, reminding everyone that good posture and a steady gaze were crucial, even in the afterlife. A household might also engage a professional mourner, whose job it was to theatrically grieve on behalf of the family, perhaps a bit like hiring a karaoke singer, but with less emphasis on key changes and more on wailing with conviction. With this entourage of emotions in play, one could hardly accuse the Victorians of skimping on drama, or entertainment if we're being honest. Despite the somber occasions, humor managed to sneak its way in, much like that one mischievous cousin who shows up unannounced and proceeds to charm everyone with stories, slightly more embellished than a Victorian gentleman's waistcoat. Families would often engage in storytelling, sharing tales of the departed's misadventures, like that time Uncle Reginald discovered the hard way that horses indeed cannot climb stairs, or how Cousin Agatha forever reversed the decorum at dinner by surreptitiously adding a live lobster to the soup tureen, thereby unraveling the tightly stitched fabric of Victorian manners in one swift crustacean flourish. Thus, through the laughter-tinged tears and the soft murmur of reminiscence, life and death sat side by side, joined by a cozy quilt of memories. The Victorians, with their signature blend of fervor and restraint, displayed a unique ability to acknowledge the inevitable with dignity while still indulging in the curious warmth of an overarching sense of continuity. As we adjust our mental monocles and peer further into the quaint quirks of this era, prepare yourself to enter the labyrinthine world of mourning. Séquin attire. From the intricacies of crinoline to the nuances of the perfect male mourning hat, we shall tiptoe through the somber yet strikingly fashionable wardrobes of the period, ensuring you are both enlightened and eloquently dressed for the next chapter's slumberous journey into Victorian life. Imagine, if you will, a world where the family parlour routinely moonlighted as the local chapel of rest. You see, in Victorian times, families didn't exactly outsource the intricate dance of life and death. Instead, they embraced the ultimate DIY project, crafting a space where Uncle Harold could hang out a bit longer, even if he was simply attending his own viewing. It's as if each home bore a bouncer who doubled as a midwife and mortician, with death being a curious part of the family routine. In those days, the death-at-home movement thrived, and not just because travel options were, shall we say, a tad impractical. Victorian families kept their shadowy companions close, so much so that keeping up with the Joneses often equated to who could offer the most refined and dignified at-home wake. After all, who needed sitcom reruns when human mortality offered its very own live performances? The task fell upon the domestic angel, usually the matriarch or eldest daughter, as she navigated the labyrinthine etiquette, surrounding new arrivals and final departures. Yet no one was particularly eager to disturb proper Victorian equilibrium. Batten down the hatches, she might think, as she stocked up on crepe and black ribbons, secretly eyeing the parlour as a potential high-traffic zone of hushed sobs and stiff upper lips. Pity the poor furniture as well. Your stately couch couldn't simply be a resting place for behinds. It needed to provide a respectable lounge for dearly departed derrière too. In this sepulchral symphony, the delicate lace curtains played their part, filtering ghostly moonlight onto the honoured guest in repose while piano music, sombre yet oddly soothing, crept into the room like a musical lily placed atop a casket. Whether the melancholy melodies played on an actual piano or were merely a figment of our sleepy storyteller's imagination is anyone's guess. Either way, dear reader, this is the historical backdrop against which these tales unwind. Now, imagine little Timmy and his sister Effie adjusting to such a morbid yet mundane spectacle, where modern youngsters might debate who gets the larger slice of birthday cake. These Victorian tots could wax lyrical on appropriate flower arrangements for Aunt Maud's farewell fest. Death wasn't creepy. It was communal, domestic even, entwined with the linens of the everyday and the lace of decorum. Yet therein lay a certain pragmatic charm. In an era where life could slip through one's fingers like a bar of precious hard soap, acceptance became a stoic partner. Victorians adored their ceremonious flights of fancy, enveloping sorrow in rituals like swaddling infants. Each family member became an archaeologist of emotion, meticulously arranging the relics of memory into small sacred collections that softened the edges of loss. Let us not forget the harried letter writers, those unsung heroes of quill and ink. Now, a dry fact in our sleep-inducing narrative, Victorian women were the religious epicenters of their families, acting as spiritual gatekeepers and correspondents. Their penned condolences, woven with empathy and Victorian flair, would make Hallmark's finest authors swoon from sheer envy. Consider the humble photograph, a memento so cherished, so lovingly crafted, it became an artifact of frozen time. Victorian photographers cunningly capitalized on the grieving market by capturing post-mortem portraits, elongated shutter speeds, lending the departed both a profound calm and slight tan of cinematic glow. As a gentle hush falls upon our tale, ponder how the Victorians seamlessly entwined solemnity and intimacy, like clockwork dancers pirouetting. To the chimes of the passing day, they masked grief in gentility, artfully convincing themselves that death, a seemingly distant spectre, was but a temporary visitor sipping tea from an impeccably polished cup. As our story continues, we shall delve further into these curious customs, leading us to yet another quiet chapter of intrigue awaiting in the wings, in a Victorian world where embroidery wasn't just a hobby, but a lifestyle choice. Death was a frequent, albeit undesired, houseguest. Imagine, if you will, a scene where family gatherings were all about who wore the blackest attire best. Ah yes, mourning fashion. A grim blend of couture and gloom, if you will. As you settle into your cozy cocoon of blankets, let us ease into a vignette of daily Victorian life, where the ticking of the grandfather clock was a constant reminder that life, and indeed grandmother, were destined to eventually wind down. Victorian families were, by necessity, well acquainted with the sombre rituals of mourning, a word that likely inspired the aphorism, "I could black lace veils in my sleep." From the moment a death occurred, social codes dictated a meticulous transformation of both person and place. Think of it as an early precursor to extreme home makeovers, Victorian style. Heavy curtains were drawn, mirrors were shrouded in dark fabric, and family portraits received a temporary halo of crepe. Why cover the mirrors, you may ask? Superstition warned that a glimpse into a mirror by the deceased's soul might lead to eternal haunting. What a way to ensure that your reflection wasn't likely to say, "Boo," at midnight. Mourning attire, much like a dedicated actor's wardrobe, varied depending on one's relationship with the dearly departed. If your darling uncle, who might have left you his cherished collection of bird-watching monocles, expired, strict etiquette suggested that a hefty commitment to wearing mourning black was needed for at least a year. For mere acquaintances, a 3-month period sufficed, though I dare say old Dame Prudence got away with a mere fortnight's nod to decorum, fueled by the fact she was running dreadfully low on ink black dye. Accessory enthusiasts would have been thrilled, as mourning offered the perfect excuse to acquire jet jewelry, named not in relation to high-flying, but to the deep, intense black of jetstone. I confess, these bleak baubles were so flattering in their darkness that some women continued to wear them long after the mourning period expired. Such trends made you the toast of a candlelit dinner, provided you wore shades other than black to the table. Alas, it wasn't all fashion and frippery. Lest we forget, mourning was a thoroughly exhausting endeavor. Victorian etiquette books, of which there were many, ideal for swatting flies, yet double as doorstops, outlined pages upon pages for bereaved families navigating the proper degree of melancholy. Funerals were often elaborate affairs, where the heft of blossoms rivaled that of pure granite gravestones. Individuals would list specific flowers in their wills, hoping in vain that a particular variety of lilies might just be the statement piece their resting place needed. Our path veers neatly into the realm of memento mori, translated as "remember you must die." Catchy, isn't it? These were tokens, both decorative and macabre, serving to remind the living of life's fleeting beauty. While some opted for tasteful hair art, imagine grandma's scalp figuratively waving hello from beyond, others lean towards less sentimental keepsakes. Picture an artisanal skull adorning the mantelpiece, portraying elegance with the eternal message, "No one leaves this world alive." And so, as you drift away, wrapped comfortably in the warm embrace of a soft whispering sleep, let the rhythmic tick-tock of history's clock lull you further into slumber. Soon, we'll step further into another quirky corner of this bygone world where life and death mingled over tea and moralistic stories. But for now, as darkness cradles you gently, sleep well, and remember to pat that cat should you encounter a ghostly spectre in a Victorian sleeping cap. Sweet dreams, dear time traveller. In the gentle, fog-draped embrace of Victorian England, death had an etiquette and, astonishingly, a literal presence within every home. Picture this: a quaint parlour adorned with lace curtains, an overly ambitious fern straddling the line between lavish and eccentric, and a room dedicated just for greeting the Grim Reaper, or at least showing him proper hospitality. Welcome to the Victorian death rituals, with their characteristic charm so quaint, it makes even the dark cloak of mortality look decidedly formal. Now the Victorians were nothing if not meticulous in their soulful dance with death. Their homes had a designated parlour, which functioned much like our modern-day living room, but with an extra special twist. You might find Great Aunt Ethel resting there in her Sunday best, except she's not quite alive. Yes, indeed, the funeral parlour served as the epicenter for all things posthumous. Families would lay out their dearly departed, inviting friends and relatives to drop by for tea, cake, and a side of intergenerational existential dread. It wasn't all as macabre as one might presume. In true Victorian fashion, everything was about appearances. Mourning attire became a veritable fashion statement. Donning black wasn't just a token nod to grief, it was high fashion. There were strict rules about how long one should wear mourning clothes, all scientifically proportionate to one's relationship with the deceased. Think of it as sartorial algebra for sorrow. Women, in particular, would adorn themselves in funereal elegance, with fabrics that could practically wallpaper all of Westminster Abbey. Crepe, bombazine, and jet jewelry accessorized their grief, offering a poetic balance between precision, couture, and commemoration. Yet the English penchant for stoicism, even in bereavement, paved the way for practices that were nothing short of heartwarming. The invention of the memento mori photograph, albeit eerie by today's Instagram standards, allowed families to capture their dearly beloved in all their eternal grace. The subjects, looking unusually serene, struck poses that were more alive than their ghostly state might suggest. These macabre mementos offered a touch of permanence in a world where orphanages and unexpected demises were as common as afternoon storms over the English Channel. Every home was equipped with mourning accessories, like the death bell, essentially a means to ward off premature interments in the event of a sluggish pulse. Imagine your embarrassment if Uncle George, thought forever lost to this world due to a particularly convincing nap, rings for afternoon tea from his subterranean lodgings. No one fancied a haunting caused by administrative oversight. And then there were the mourning postcards. These weren't your average scribblings of "wish you were here." Instead, they were populated with tastefully somber motifs and prose that somehow managed to find the delicate line between acknowledgement and, dare I say, cheer. With headers such as "in loving memory" to candid snapshots of the departed, the cards travelled through a network of empathetic postmen, lovingly lugging final farewells through misty avenues and cobbled streets. Children, ever resilient and resourceful, were included yet shielded from the melancholy. Sometimes, in a strange exhibition of coping, they'd create little death-themed tableaux with their dollhouses, complete with tiny plastic funerals. It was as if innocence met morbidity for tea and concluded that all life under Queen Victoria's reign was but a learning opportunity. Family pets, not to be outdone by their human counterparts, also got a taste of Victorian death rituals. When Fido, the Yorkshire Terrier, shuffled off to the great kennel in the sky, a special plot was prepared in the garden. A small gravestone would mark the spot, often with a witty epithet like "he barked his last." This fascination with the afterlife permeated every facet of Victorian life, illustrating a time when death was close and cozy, a not unwelcome guest at the dinner table of life. They lived with it, dressed it up, and even had tea with it, quite literally seeing off their dearly departed with a flair that only an era of grandeur could muster. As the final embers of the fireplace dwindle into quieter shades of orange and gold, setting a gentle backdrop against the tapestry of time, we find ourselves gently turning the page of this archaic calendar. The air is rife with whispered tales yet to unfurl, a gentle nudge that beckons to explore further, as dreams stir in chorus with the night's embrace, as dusk slipped its lavender shawl over the bustling streets of Victorian London. Another day's round of chimney smoke settled like a sooty kiss upon the city's rooftops. It was in this peculiar setting that Victoriana's favourite pastime was born, the morbid family living room tableau, where death took centre stage. Unlike today's minimalist decors and spare neutral palettes, Victorian living rooms were a visual cacophony of floral patterns and stately curios. They were adorned through and through by all things intricately lively and perhaps a tad over-enthusiastic. Yet, among this decorative enthusiasm, a spectre lived cloaked. The art of mourning was practically an Olympic sport for these families. The smell of dried flowers mingled with the gentle aroma of something we might call despair. But fear not. For the Victorians, this was all quite normal. Losing a loved one was, quite literally, part of the furniture. Imagine, if you will, the grand old drawing room, a room where the family gathered for tea and eloquent silence. Here, where children learn to sip from porcelain cups without revealing the gory details of their homemade experiments conducted with their tea biscuits, the Victorians performed a curious ritual. It's called lying in state, only in far less familiar terms, translated to having Uncle Bertie's farewell ceremony at home. Back then, undertakers were a little more of the DIY variety, and so the family living room frequently moonlighted as a homegrown funeral parlour. Sally the charwoman, doubling as both housekeeper and improbable philosopher, would come by for her bi-weekly dust-off and toss a bemused quip or two about the deceased. "Shot through his trousers," she might say, regarding the bullet holes in poor Bertie's waistcoat, all the while tweaking floral arrangements with the aplomb of one who knows violets thrive on irony. But Bertie's family didn't mind his posthumous residency among the mingling pots of tea and mourning guests. You see, in an era where sentimental lockets included snippets of hair from beloved ancestors, And macabre artwork was just a thing you did on a Wednesday afternoon. Dearly departed Uncle Bertie's continued presence in the home was somewhat comforting. He never spilt his drink after all, a more commendable trait than young Percival could muster. The Victorians cultivated grief somewhat like a rose garden. It required meticulous attention, frequent illumination, and occasionally a good sprinkling of existential dread. Oblivious to modern conveniences like professional grief counselors or Netflix series about haunted real estate, they handled everything in-house. Family portraits included the recently deceased, strangely lifelike in the sepia glow of a photographic plate, sometimes captured mid-sit at the piano or holding a rather impressive grin for authenticity's sake. Here, social gatherings were an intriguing mix of celebration and melancholy. Conversations meandered from the latest in Gothic literature to the best embalming techniques. Each meeting was an eloquent dance on threads of memory and tradition, weaving tales that were anything but boring. One could almost hear the echoes of laughter tinge the dust caught by the late afternoon sun through the lace curtains. Despite what contemporary society may think, this Victorian familiarity with mortality wasn't merely a quirk. It was a form of preparedness, an art of gauging life's ephemeral fairness. And though this chapter in Time served evening tea alongside immortalized memorabilia, such customs cast a splendid light on the family's resilience. The darkness of their Victorian parlours hid neither ghostly secrets nor haunted artifacts, but instead illuminated life's fragile beauty. If ever you paused to listen closely, you might have heard a spirited chuckle rising from the hearth, a whispering that perhaps the living and the dearly missed were not so different after all. Death loved company, and in those rooms he'd found a heartwarming home. And so, as you sink back into your own pillows, consider the Victorian home not merely as a place of sorrow, but a gallery of life, love, and the occasional peculiar arrangement of deceased Uncle Bertie. Now, with your thoughts gently wandering away, we'll lightly cross the parlour's threshold, prepared to uncover yet another wonder from history's well-kept confessions. Sweet dreams await, dear listener. In the soft glow of candlelight, we turn our attention to the Victorian parlour, which could rightfully be described as the Airbnb of sorrow. You see, Victorian households possessed a peculiar knack for hospitality when it came to death. Unlike today, where we prefer to send our dearly departed on a one-way trip to the funeral home, Victorians loved nothing more than to host a good old-fashioned wake right from the comfort of their own drawing room. It was as if their doilies whispered, "Come for the scones, stay for the souls." Bodies, they believed, were best suited for repose amidst the familiar surroundings of lavish drapery and the comforting gaze of ancestral portraits. If you were to attend a Victorian wake, you might find yourself trading small talk with Aunt Edith, who had just that day become more silent than usual. Proud of their sharp suits and stiff upper lips, Victorians elegantly wrestled grief into submission by turning their homes into miniature cemeteries. As you picture the scene, imagine a long wooden table, possibly mahogany, topped with essential accoutrements for the occasion, stacks of sandwiches with the crusts dutifully removed, floral arrangements more dramatic than any Broadway show, and the latest edition of Grief Be Gone, a 6-stage guide to making peace with your deceased. Truly, it was a buffet of melancholy mixed with ham and mustard. In the matter of mourning attire, Victorians rivaled today's Fashion Week. No self-respecting mourner would dash off to a wake without donning their most somber Friday best. Jet black fabrics became the haute couture of the mid-19th century, so much so that milliners were simply drowning in a sea of veils and crepe. If you didn't have a closet full of mourning clothes, could you even consider yourself part of the societal horde? One particular fashionista, a certain Queen Victoria, championed this trend with all the fervour of a monarch determined not to smile for 40 years. Following Prince Albert's death, she became the poster child for the half-century-long fashion statement known as "Forever in Black," proving that no amount of corsetry could constrict one's dedication to eternal grief chic. But oh, how the Victorians loved a uniform. While we modern folk have shrunk death to a whispery finale, Victorians celebrated life's end as if the Grim Reaper himself had. RSVP'd, sending out engraved invitations. Children would peek around fringe-draped doorway corners, acquainting themselves early with life's inevitable exclamation mark. You might suppose this morbid practice would result in a society of pale-faced ghouls clutching their teacups like lifelines, but it seemed to have the opposite effect. In essence, Death was a resident of the Victorian household, a demure guest who lingered politely in the background, gently encouraging reflection over tea and crumpets. And while we're at it, let's not forget the Victorian obsession with post-mortem photography, because what better way to commemorate Aunt Edith's departure than with a sepia-toned snapshot? No matter if the subject was more waxwork than human at this point, Victorians had a peculiar appreciation for documenting such moments, perhaps envisioning a future where their death photos might fetch a tidy sum on Antiques Roadshow. As you let the soothing cadence of these tales carry you deeper into your doze, imagine closing your eyes amidst such peculiar customs, surrounded by the echo of distant clock chimes, the rustle of mourning attire, and the gentle buzz of conversation over death's shadowy embrace. And softly, as a wisp of London fog on a spring morning, we will drift onward to discover more curious secrets hidden within the fabric of boring history, whose destination lay just beyond the edge of slumber. As the evening gas lamps flickered to life outside the parlour's window, casting their gentle glow over the Victorian family's meticulously decorated sitting room, the time had come for another nightly game of Guess Which Roommate is a Ghost. Victorian homes had an uncanny knack for turning familial tragedy into part of the regular decor, akin to an English marmalade that has foreign bits you just couldn't identify. In those days, families, in their natural Victorian somberness, held death close, a little too close for modern standards. There was often a cozy familiarity with it, much like a well-used pair of stiff leather boots that inevitably made themselves known at tea parties. Now, imagine, if you will, a sitting room where dust sparkles in the gaslight, dancing through the air with the ghostly grace of a music hall debutante. It's within these walls that objects loved ones, once cherished, seem to whisper secrets to the curious and the bored alike. It was common practice for loved ones who couldn't quite make their way to a cemetery plot just yet to reside at home for a few freshly brewed pots of tea. Yes, dear listeners, before you take in that next relaxing breath, let it soothe your imagination as you picture William, the usually unremarkable uncle, barely distinguishable from the furniture when alive, mind you, now comfortably occupying the chaise, long in eternal repose. A temporary guest, for he would soon venture into the backyard to find his forever peace, perhaps beneath a rosebush. Now, one must not forget the Victorian penchant for the macabre games of the mind. Familial aftermath was decidedly a stitched patchwork of intrigue, riddles, and friendly wagers over whether a sound in the night might be attributed to deer, Aunt Agatha tapping her fingernails, reminding her descendants she wanted no lilies at her wake. These homes served as spiritual junctions, where above and below stairs were merely different realms of existence, separated by a slight draught or the echo of old footsteps. Herein lay the imperceptible rhythm of life and death's cohabitation, duly noted by the stern but secretly tender housekeeper, Mrs. Pinwhistle, who swore she could communicate with the dearly departed, with the help of her scones, which left something to be desired by taste buds, both living and spectral. During this time, photography emerged as the newest enchantment, capturing likenesses in silver-coated sheets that shimmered with life. Or in some somber sittings, the awed stillness of death. Post-mortem photographs became Victorian keepsakes, for what better way to remember Cousin Edith than as she delicately dozed into the afterlife, clutching flowers plucked from the rigid garden soil, arranged with a precision, rivaling the spiciest curries. Both were to be taken with a hint of caution, you understand. Beyond the threshold of drawing rooms adorned with velvet and mahogany, superstitions wove themselves into daily lives. Mirrors might be draped in heavy shrouds to prevent the spirits from getting lost or taking an unwanted fancy to one's reflection. Although back then, it was probably a fair look at the mourning face that kept ghosts at bay. A stroll through this period was not complete without the grand weeping willows that dotted the solemn gardens, reigning over ironwork grave markers and lingering whispers of, "Have you heard the latest about Mr. Quigley's spectral tantrum?" Yet, for all the hallowed solemnity, death was far from the uninvited guest. It was part of the household schedule, much like dinner at 7. With a gentle nod to the worth of letting one's past mingle politely with the present, the spirits seemed to add an unseen balance to the classic Victorian scene. So as you drift into the velvet-lined depths of sleep, ponder the mysterious worlds blended within a single home's brick walls and in the silken softness of your dreams, perhaps you may catch a glimpse of the next chapter's unfolding. Welcome, dear listener, to our quaint Victorian household where death was not an uninvited guest, but a somewhat expected cohabitant, like an overly insistent cat that insists on sitting on your newspaper just when you're most engrossed in the headlines. During this time, death had an uncanny knack for being both inconvenient and oddly companionable. As you gently settle into the plush upholstery of your imagination, let us drift through the dimly lit corridors of a typical Victorian home. Picture, if you will, a parlour draped in heavy damask curtains, where the air is thick with the scent of drying lavender, an optimistic attempt to mask the peculiar whiff of formaldehyde emanating from Uncle Leonard in the corner. Now, Uncle Leonard, God bless him, was not what one might call a social being, at least not since his unfortunate bout with gravity and the family portrait. Nevertheless, there he sat, or rather, he reclined supinely in his finely crafted walnut coffin, displayed with the kind of grandiosity best reserved for weddings or particularly challenging games of charades. You see, Victorians had an endearing penchant for hosting their dearly departed in the home. Somewhere between laying out the table for tea and feeding the budgie, setting up a wake was simply part of the routine. This practice, known as lying in state, was all the rage. It provided the grieving family a chance to humour their dearly departed's stubborn need to attend parties, even if their contribution to the conversation was somewhat limited. It might seem macabre to our modern sensibilities, akin to having an ambiguously animated mannequin as a conversation starter, but back in the day, letting Aunt Matilda's keen eye follow you across the room was simply considered polite company. The Victorians, bless their morose little hearts, believed that death was an extension of life's social calendar. Part of this was due to the high mortality rates of the era. Another part perhaps stemmed from their curious sense of propriety. Here was a society that treated death not as a troublesome interloper, but as a firm but fair librarian, gently reminding them of their overdue book. In this way, death was woven into the fabric of their lives, and they managed to cope with decorum that could make even the stateliest of penguins seem manic by comparison. The ritual of mourning itself was governed by a labyrinth of strict etiquette. Black was not merely a colour choice, but a sartorial declaration, a flag flown half-mast on the caravan of daily life. Mourning clothes were worn like emotional uniforms that whispered, "I am grieving. Handle with care." Ladies were adept at their mourning attire, with jet jewellery that would jingle just so, like a particularly sombre tambourine. They avoided any jollity that could sway their sombre melodies into the dissonance of laughter. But amidst the melancholic grandeur, there existed a pocket of unfathomable beauty. The family album would surely showcase post-mortem photography, where the deceased were coaxed into lifelike poses, surrounded by their kin as though contemplating whether to go ballroom dancing or engage in a serious game of whist. Bizarre as it may seem, these images were keepsakes, tokens of affection to remember the lost souls by, a snapshot of the family's eternal Sunday brunch. As we linger here, in the shadowy glow of a Victorian parlour where the tick of the grandfather clock marks time as surely as the midnight rain patters against the window pane, let us gently laze back in our chaise longues. Imagine now the fabled journey into another realm where our story takes us beyond the cobblestone streets and where the allure of history continues to weave its whimsical, if slightly peculiar, spell over our slumbering senses. And so, dear listener, as you drowse into the mellifluous hum of Victorian whispers, prepare yourself to wander further into the velvety folds of this beguiling tapestry of the past. In the heart of Victorian England, living in a grand house with death silently residing in the parlour was as ordinary as tea time. Imagine the parlour, a space adorned with velvet drapes, a hint of floral wallpaper, and a robust, yet altogether too creaky, fainting couch. This setting was less a matter of morbid preference and more a cultural punctuation mark of an era fascinated by the finality of life, and the various attire worn in its honour. Victorian mourning attire could constitute an entire fashion line today. Start your season with crepe dresses, heavily laden with ribbons and jet beads. To accessorize, consider a black bonnet, veiled in lace so dense it might double as blackout curtains. These garments, while beautifully crafted, were also notorious for trapping all manner of dust and, of course, the lingering aromas of an era not known for its hygiene revolutions. Women, tasked with the role of mourning's grand stewards, adhered to strict sartorial codes. They would mourn their dearly departed husbands for a period that seemed slightly excessive, 2 years. Those 2 premeditated calendar turns might not be entirely dedicated to sorrow. They were more Victorian practicality, cloaked in societal expectations, a fashion marathon rather than a sprint. Occasionally, these dark costumes almost functioned as a practical joke on the public. Picture Sally returning a smile to Mr. Higgins from behind her fogged-up veil, unbeknownst to his absent gaze, while he guesses if she's delighted, enraptured, or perhaps just had a bit too much of Aunt Beatrice's infamous prune pudding. Children, in this somber dress rehearsal of sorts, often wore white, not because of their angelic innocence, the Victorians weren't, opening any grand theological debates, but because it was the only colour that could possibly irradiate their perpetually jam-covered face and knees. Death was made a welcome, if uncomfortable, houseguest for several days before the final farewell. The deceased, lying elegantly in their best attire, lay in the parlour, partially for the family's reflection, and perhaps as a sneaky judge of who among the living arrived wearing the wrong shades of black, or worse, none at all. Such faux pas provided ample fodder for whispers over tea, the humdrum gossip of Aunt Gertrude, and as fuel for Mrs. Worthwhile's weekly accolade of most imprudent mourning wardrobe. There was, ironically, a flourishing trade in death. Victorian photograph albums often showcased more departed family members than living ones. These portraits were not the stuff of Instagram. No filters, no candid poses. They featured the ultimate stillness only eternal repose could grant. The finest photographers of the day were more akin to magicians, gliding around rooms, adjusting curtains and light, not for a splashing of colours, but for just the right amount of solemnity. Thus, an air of peculiar familiarity enveloped the Victorians' interaction with death, a comfortable coexistence that allowed life itself to shine with perhaps a little more humility. Death, in its omnipresence, was a polite social visitor, promising nothing if not punctuality. As the clock in the parlour ticked relentlessly toward the next sundown, the family wrapped themselves in the tranquil assurance that another day had passed, all the while slightly wary of who might not cross tomorrow's dawn. Morning tea awaited, stirred with more than a teaspoon of introspection and perhaps just a pinch of sugar. Rest assured, our journey continues through the daily lives of those whose relationships with time and mortality make ours seem a shade less Victorian. And as these stories settle like a warm, comforting blanket over your dreaming mind, we gently drift toward another nocturnal chapter where the whispers of those bygone days await us. As the gaslights flickered, their gentle illumination against the soot of another dreary London evening, we find ourselves stepping quietly into the drawing room of a Victorian home. Here, in this cosy nook, engulfed by the trustworthy glow of coal fires and the comforting scent of mothballs, families gathered to reminisce, to bore one another with tales, but mostly to grapple with the ever-looming presence of mortality. Victorians, you see, were a unique bunch. They were positively obsessed with death, not in the morbid way that might make them a danger at dinner parties, but in a rather practical manner. In a time where diseases gallantly swept through populations, leaving behind enough orphans to constitute their own lunch hour, it was common for families to host the dearly departed right there in their sitting rooms. Yes, why not have Uncle Harold hang around? Just a bit longer posthumously. There he'd lie, in all his embalmed splendor, tucked neatly between the spinet piano and the settee, as if nodding approvingly at your choice of wallpaper. Victorian homes, after all, were the original Airbnb for ghosts, offering hospitable stays with a side of Victoria sponge. While our modern sensibilities might cringe at the thought of tea service among the embalming fluid, Victorians found comfort, and perhaps a bit of grim humor, in confronting death head-on. Much like a determined house cat with a botanical nuisance, they faced the inevitable twists of fate with a stiff upper lip and an impressive collection of mourning attire. Mourning was all the rage, and the Victorians delighted in its fashionable aspect. While today we might scramble to find another use for that lavender bridesmaid dress, a Victorian could don mourning garb with zeal, safe in the knowledge that someone else would inevitably shuffle off this mortal coil sooner rather than later. Audrey behind the haberdashery was positively envied for her extensive wardrobe of black. In those evenings, children were often found immersed in a peculiar literary genre that combined subtle entertainment with a dash of ethical instruction. Enter moral tales, where animals talked, children learned valuable lessons, and everyone somehow seemed more cheerful after a grim encounter with a conscience-loving ghost. These narratives, though at times illogically didactic, which is a polite way of saying frightfully boring, were deemed highly educational. They were among the many ways Victorians faced life's transiency, with a blend of humor and practicality that would put today's motivational speakers to shame. We might suspect that if TED Talks existed then, they would have made smashing use of phantoms keen on the importance of virtue in one's afterlife. And so, with hearths glowing warmly against the dim night, these families, swathed in their Victorian veils, seeding carried on. They went about their routines, showed occasional deference to the spectre chilling near the potted ferns, and when the moonlight spilled just right, shared a smile over the rim of their teacups, knowing that nothing, except perhaps Aunt Beatrice's questionable gooseberry marmalade, was permanent. In these stories gathered around hearths, the Victorian spirit lived, inviting its audience to peer into the flickerings of shadow and light and find comfort in the certainty of things unseen, yet in that peculiar way of adding splendor to the inevitable gloom. They found life even amidst the silent watch of the dead, a tenacity of spirit that seemed to say, "Take on your ghosts with fortitude and a lace-trimmed cravat." As the echoes of whispered conversations and the gentle ticking of the mantel clock steered us toward an end, we could feel the slow passage of time, a steady march into the enveloping embrace of history. Softly, like leaves rustling in an autumn, seek a breeze. We inch closer to sleep, knowing the night holds more tales to unfold, just as the Victorians might whisper of strange dreams where spirits roam free, seeking only the warmth of an ear to listen and a soul kind enough to remember. As the heavy drapes fluttered languidly in the dim glow of the gas lamps, we slipped once more into the world of Victorian households where, believe it or not, having a corpse in the drawing room was as common as owning a vase of withering lilies. This was a period when sincerity and morbidity walked hand in hand, with a grace that might surprise you. Today we shall peer behind heavy velvet curtains into the distinctively peculiar ways in which these families lived with a constant, albeit silent, houseguest, death itself. Picture this: a handsome Victorian parlour adorned with the quintessential dark mahogany furniture, tasseled fringes, and of course an inevitable piano strategically placed to show the family's level of culture. Among the oil, portraits of somber relatives lining the wallpapered walls, there lay a dear departed relative poised as if on an extended visit. And while the Victorians didn't haul out barrels of mead to toast the dearly deceased like the Vikings might have, they possessed their own brand of post-mortem rituals that kept death from becoming a dull affair. Death, you see, in those quainter days, wore many hats, or should I say, bonnets. It was a time when mourning dress was the height of fashion, and social etiquette demanded a seasonal approach to your attire, even when bidding farewell to Aunt Mildred. A black crepe gown was a must for the first few months following a family member's expiration, after which one might cautiously introduce shades of lavender or grey into their closet, never straying too far from the depths of solemnity. It was considered not only respectful, but part of one's solemn duty to present oneself as a walking symbol of successful grieving, like a seasonal wardrobe. Ain't change, but considerably more grave. Households were always prepared for their inevitable gatherings around deathbeds with a gravitas that today's event planners could scarcely comprehend. Black-bordered stationery quickly printed the sad tidings for distant relatives, while mourning jewelry, often made with the hair of the deceased woven intricately within, provided a tangible connection to the one who'd ventured beyond. These trinkets, mind you, were cherished as dearly as your modern, wardrobe staple little black dress. Even the decor spoke to death's perennial presence. Victorians had a penchant for novelty, especially if it was slightly morbid. Glass domes displayed floral arrangements or tiny animal skeletons, which although may now make even the staunchest modern minimalist recoil, to Victorians were simply delightful conversation starters over buttered crumpets. And then there was the curious case of post-mortem photography, the meticulous art of capturing one last visage of the deceased, which custom dictated be done in a manner suggestive of quiet repose. Families would gather the recently departed and arrange them as if merely captured in a moment of serene reflection. Inching into the frame, the living stood beside their lost relations, composing a family portrait like no other, at least until the next decently somber occasion warranted another group shot. In the heart of this curiously charming era, juggled with precise domestic displacement, the family parlour became the stage on which life and death was played out with enviable poise. Victorian homes pulsated with an aura of graceful acceptance, each ornate skirting board and sconce whispering warmly of the passage of time and pace of life. As we extinguish the last of our evening candles and allow the echoes of Victorian parlours to draw the curtains down, we tread softly into next tales. Gently, in the dim glow of another time's hearth, we shall continue to explore the quiet corners and creative curiosities that lace their way through the hearts and homes of those who paved our history with such delightful eccentricity. But that, dear sleeper, is a story for another evening's ramble. As the soft glow of gaslights flickered across cobblestone streets and created shadows that danced like forgotten spirits, the Victorian home remained a sanctuary where life and mystery converged seamlessly. Here, in this peculiar age of crinoline and contraptions, families made peace with death as an unassuming household guest, much like a distant cousin invited over for a perpetual afternoon tea. Victorian homes weren't just places of bustling activity and genteel gatherings. They were also the central stage for life's final act. The parlour, often dusted with the scent of lavender and enveloped with the gentle brass notes of a pianoforte, was humorously rebranded as the death room. It was not, despite its somber association, a place of dreariness, but rather a room of reflection and grace. You see, Victorians had a knack for ritualizing life so grandly that even death had its social season. For families, the passing of a loved one meant weeks filled not only with mourning, but with meticulous planning, as if prepping for an oddly morose yet quintessentially fashionable gala. Enter wrapped props, the mourning garb. You'd need a sartorial GPS guide to navigate the fabric maze of crepe, bombazine, and jet beads. Even Queen Victoria herself set quite the monochromatic trend, going all in on widow's weeds, a pioneer of the Gothic casual look and quite possibly the original influencer of emo fashion. Victorian society commanded a dance with the solemnity of death that was at times comical in its exacting detail. One could spend months in half-mourning, a phase which involved transitioning wardrobes from deep black to muted purples and greys. Meanwhile, fashion critics of the time itched for columns that would mention the occasional slip-up, i.e., rebellious hint of scarlet or an audacious floral pattern, signaling either sartorial insouciance or a grave unawareness of societal norms. Within these homes, the art of letter writing blossomed to document sentiments about those who shuffled off this mortal coil. Poetry, postcards, and even hair lockets, yes, real hair twined into jewelry, were exchanged as tokens brimming with both emotion and, let's admit, a dash of macabre creativity. Imagine brushing the hair of a departed loved one each morning, twining it into your coiffures as a peculiar Victorian homage. Talk about a new hair care regime, and let us tiptoe into the daily life of the Victorian child who grew up understanding that their home was often a breeding ground for both curiosity and contemplation about mortality. For the young, death wasn't the ghastly figure from garish modern culture, but rather an anticipated figure, akin to the postman, just with a darker uniform. When children weren't busy as makeshift flower arrangers for funerary wreaths, they found companionship in a good hearty game of mock funeral, something akin to present-day make-believe, but with unseasonal black tulips the kids picked from the garden before their too serious role-play. On particularly misty evenings, the chimney might sigh out billows of smoke from a hotbed of familial conversation about spirits. Were they listening? Perhaps. Poltergeists, after all, had as much right to a warm hearth as anyone else. Some households even welcome mediums, no more eccentric than a voice calling from another room, trying to soothe the stoicism of a lost relative. But here's a twist. Imagine finding Uncle Henry in the afterlife markedly less verbose and more Victorian than he ever was in the corporeal sense. As the quiet hours unfolded in gentle layers of moonlight, families would nestle into their beds, the backdrop of fading embers and softly creaking floorboards, a lullaby unto itself. Beneath the rhythmic tick of the pendulum clock, they drifted into dreams as elaborate and often as hauntingly comforting as the lives they'd led in the light of day. And as the house sighed into slumber, resting in the rich tapestry of its history and the lives it cradled, a new day awaited with its intriguing yet unchanged dance between vitality and the inevitable embrace that follows us all. Snuggle in, dear listener. There's more to this tale of time and traditions that will unfold gently as dawn tiptoes across misty Victorian roofs. Imagine a Victorian living room, flickering from the glow of a dozen wax candles, each working tirelessly to combat the creeping dusk already painting dark corners. In this elegant chamber, every carved wooden chair and proudly polished table carried stories older than most grandparents. Amidst these silent witnesses of time, the Victorian family gathered like a cast of characters from an unfinished play, each member taking their place in the curious interplay between life and death. But you see, death wasn't an uninvited guest in these homes. Rather, it was a familiar, albeit spectral, acquaintance. These families didn't send condolences by text or sit in long queues awaiting morgues. Oh no, they practiced a tradition that would have Instagram influencers clutching their pearls. Memento mori. Latin, of course, for remember you must die. A cheery thought, especially when whispered like a mischievous secret as they fluffed the pillows for an unexpected guest. In these days of horse-drawn hearse and mourning brooches, the Victorian home was a stage for extravagant exits, as much as for life's grand entrances. The parlour, where one might typically find Aunt Mildred offering noxious scones, often doubled as the final curtain call venue for a dearly departed. There they lay, posed for a poignant post-mortem portrait. Imagine Uncle Alfred, in repose as peaceful as a slumbering bear in his best Sunday suit, showcasing the peak of Victorian bedhead, while surrounded by loving relatives bearing grimaces reminiscent of those questioned under oath. suddenly feel the urge to expand your family album to include your less animated ancestors. The Victorians weren't bogged down by the morbid. With a quick timeline scroll, they skipped over awkward family Christmas photo and went straight to dearly departed dearest. The aim was not to dwell morbidly on loss, but to weave it into the tapestry of everyday life as naturally as embroidering daisies on a handkerchief. Now, before you imagine the entire family perpetually swimming in black crepe and veils, know that mourning was a fashion statement with a surprisingly rigid dress code. Widows followed a timetable stricter than a clockmaker's for their grief attire. 2 years for deepest black, a sartorial declaration akin to drafting a gloomy sonnet with one's wardrobe. Yet even death's shroud had its trend-worthy shades, transitioning from jet black despair to dashing grays and amorphous mauves, with each hue whispered about in hushed conversations at the latest wake. Children, too, were draped in this cultural tapestry, albeit as charming diminutive spectres. Unfortunately, life expectancy was often shorter than an overzealous haiku, making small coffins an all-too-familiar sight. However, the prospect of loss didn't sour the spirits of young Victorians entirely. They too participated in rituals of remembrance, their toy soldiers and dolls lined up neatly as attendant mourners, a tiny vanguard against the encroachment of sadness. And so, the family dispatched notes in black-rimmed envelopes, an archaic email proclaiming their sorrow to the distant relations. Thus, the dance of mourning moved beyond the home, a social tapestry where the strings of shared grief wove families even tighter. By embracing death's presence in such a manner, like inviting a stray cat you didn't really want but mysteriously began to love, life's fragility gained summer texture, enhancing each precious breath's fleeting beauty. Such was the paradox of Victorian life, intricate, meticulous, heartwarming, and yes, even humorous. For when one lives with ghosts just a sherry glass away, life's delight takes on a sunnier hue. For every somber tale, bound in a mourning ring, there lay a shared laughter, reflecting not the darkness of loss, but the shared joy of remembering. As today's evening curtains draw, with each snuffed candle, one by one, whispering their good nights, we drift into tranquil dreams, where the Victorians tiptoe quietly, ever the watchful custodians of life's eternal journey, until the parlour's shadows cradle us completely, surrendering to sleep's gentle embrace. Ah, the Victorian era, a time when every outfit seemed to contain enough lace to rig a sailing ship, and families had a peculiar waltz with mortality, performing an odd dance right within the walls of their own homes. It was an age when decorum was as starchy as their collars, and afternoons were filled with the rhythmic ticking of mantel clocks, a constant reminder that even time itself politely observed proper etiquette. Within the Victorian household, the parlour was not merely a parlour, but served as a distinguished multifunctional stage for life's grande performances. In this one room, you might encounter a cozy tea gathering, a competent rendition of Chopin from a spinet piano, or something close to Chopin, and, least likely of all, a viewing in which the dearly departed might be found resting more peacefully than anyone dared suggest on a cushiony chaise lounge. It was the embodiment of the phrase, "all the world's a stage," with the veil between life and death being as thin as those lace-trimmed handkerchiefs sobbed into during sentimental novels. Victorian families were something of pioneers in their macabre yet oddly cozy relationship with death. Unlike today's preference for keeping matters of mortality discreetly tucked away, the Victorians saw death as a natural extension of life. They embraced it much like they did a particularly challenging game of croquet, somberly, yet with a Gilbert and Sullivan penchant for the dramatic. One can picture it now, lounging upon a floral-printed settee, needlepoint in hand, the matriarch of the household, striking up conversation in gentle tones with her children's dead grandfather, as if discussing the weather. Because heavens, what gentleman in the afterlife doesn't want to know if it's going to rain? This casual approach to the presence of the dearly departed was a part of daily life and conversation, like commenting on a neighbour's new carriage or the day's cut of mutton. Take, for example, the sombre guests of a Victorian funeral. diligently examining the intricate mourning attire around them. Mourning dress was as elaborately codified as the rituals themselves. It befitted the solemnity of the occasion, with enough black crepe-adoring sleeves and bonnets to stage a crescendo in Wagner's opera. There were rules as precise as a Swiss watch, since failing to dress correctly was as grievous as dining on fish without the appropriate fork. Yet all this mourning regalia didn't obstruct the Victorians' penchant for a moment of levity, often found in the form of memento mori photographs. Families would occasionally choose to include their departed members in a family photo, utilizing all the tools at their disposal to make the dearly departed appear as lively as possible. Propped up, with eyes painted on eyelids or held up by discreet supports, it's possibly the only art form where, say cheese, resulted in an ironically eternal smile. Not to be forgotten, of course, is the after-burial wake, an event colored with both sadness and cakes. Lots and lots of cakes. Like every good suspense novel, it was there you might hear the sort of gossipy closing remarks about the deceased that in life would be whispered behind gloved hands. The deceased, lying in state, often had more visitors than a Regency ballroom preening with aristocrats. Austerity mingled exuberance, creating a scene Dickens himself might pen with a twirl of his quill. Yet, the ever-affable Victorians performed the ultimate balancing act. They combined the morbid with the mundane in a way only the British could, with a wry smile and an ample serving of sponge cake. And as we drift through our tale, as the lull of history's breath begins to draw us nearer to that portal between sleep and consciousness, one can only wonder at what quaint antics and wisdoms the next chapter might unveil. In our pursuit of soothing bedtime narratives, let us draw the velvet curtains for now, allowing gentle dreams of antiquity to tiptoe in. For soon, we'll tiptoe back into the company of cobbled streets and shadowy alleyways, where whispers of the past softly dance in the cool, reflective glow of a gaslit world. In the Victorian era, people had an unusual relationship with death. Instead of treating it as a somber event, best shrouded in hushed whispers and heavy drapery, they invited death into their homes almost as enthusiastically as if it were a long-lost cousin arriving with cakes. In Chapter 16 of our delightful slumber journey, we explore the rather curious way the Victorians integrated death into their daily lives, as if even the Grim Reaper himself would pause for a spot of tea and a polite nod. First, let's consider the Victorian parlour, not just a room where a wayward cat might snooze atop the mantel. Oh no, it was also where the dearly departed would linger for one last bout of familial hospitality. Picture it, a cosy room lined with doilies, plump cushions, and sombre portraits of ancestors long past, all circled around Uncle Albert, now eternally horizontal. Families believed it crucial that the soul received a proper send-off, overseen by the watchful eyes of Aunt Mildred and her dedicated Quilters' Guild. Nothing says dignified farewell like hand-sewn quilts draping over brass caskets. Of course, necessity bred creativity. The notion of reusing mourning garments was commonplace, not only due to thriftiness, but as a morbid ticket into high society. If you wanted to be in vogue while greeting the afterlife, you simply had to put on your best black bombazine dress, a fabric that, in our modern age, sounds suspiciously like a villainous concoction from a 4 a.m. infomercial. Is your mourning wear losing its pizzazz? Fear not. With bombazine's patented sad shimmer, even the dullest funeral will feel couture. Then there were the heady odors of grieving, a veritable symphony of scents that could make even a swanky French parfumier weep. The Victorians loved their fragrances, and at a time when something as simple as coughing discreetly into one's gloves could signify several illnesses, most of them fatal, they eagerly adopted camphor, rosewater, and the omnipresent lavender. The goal was to ensure that, even in death, no relative took their leave without leaving an impression. Preferably one that smelled like great-grandma's potpourri, devotion, Victorian style. came with its own set of odd rituals. Some families adopted the practice of creating mourning jewelry, edgy yet heartfelt. Locks of hair from the dearly departed snaked their way into lockets, rings, and even brooches, reminding everyone that the loved one was never truly forgotten or far away, whether dangling from an ear or nestled against one's chest. Imagine wearing a DNA heirloom that won't earn you a life insurance payout, just a knowing smile at the next ball. It's important to remember that this era was rife with superstition, a form of crowd-pleasing paranoia mingling with deep-seated belief. Mirrors were swiftly covered as a precaution, lest a wayward soul peer back in astonishment or journey into realms uncharted and reflective. Indeed, the idea of spectral doppelgangers loitering about was far scarier than a week's worth of missed millinery appointments. Nestled amidst quaint remembrance and somber rigmarole lay a burgeoning industry ripe with entrepreneurial flair. The Victorians, ever the inventive pragmatists, made memento mori photography quite the swan song. For a fee, photographers could set the deceased into lifelike poses, capturing eternal slumber in eerie detail. The results were uncanny, perhaps slightly unsettling, but supremely valuable. Long before social media influencers curated their feeds, these families mastered the art of posthumous memory, complete with tasteful lace edging and an appropriately dour background. The Victorians turned coping with death into an art form, reshaping every dark cloud into something handcrafted, tasseled, and steeped in sentimentality. Say what you will, they were remarkably dedicated decorators of dignity. As you let these thoughts of lace, bowler hats, and gently perfumed parlors drift from your mind, allow yourself to sink further into the warmth of your covers. The essence of Victorian charm lingers, but rest assured, our tale continues to wind through history's curious hallways, all in due time. In the muted twilight of industrial age England, where chimney sweeps danced through soot and scandal, Victorian families found themselves living intimately with the concept of death. This closeness wasn't macabre. Rather, it was like an old acquaintance stopping by unannounced for tea. Perhaps a tad overfamiliar, but ultimately just part of the chaos. Imagine a household brimming with children, elders, and pets, each tangentially connected by the most persistent guest of all: mortality. With life expectancy tipping in favor of death at what we modern folks consider a brisk age, the Victorians rather astutely structured their homes around this inevitability. Picture parlors filled with plush drapery, not only pocked by errant shillings, retrieved from the couch by tiny hands, but also canvases for mourning. Yes, Victorian decor was marvelously versatile, redolent of both life and beyond. Portraits of dear departed Aunt Agatha hung on walls like emotionally charged wallpaper, while hair lockets of Uncle Bertie's suspiciously prolific tresses adorned the necks of distraught cousins. It's worth noting that death, it seems, made quite the fashionable accessory. Now, lest you think these customs morbid, allow me to soften the picture. Victorian death had its own etiquette guidebook, replete with the stern suggestion to always have spare black crepe on hand, just in case you weren't properly dressed for the spur-of-the-moment funeral or widowhood. Black was, after all, the little black dress of its time, solemn and yet invariably dapper. Children, those precocious harbingers of either mirth or mishaps, learned of death organically, the way one might learn that Brussels sprouts are broccoli's less amiable cousin. They played among weathered gravestones as we might kick a soccer, me-ball through dewy suburban lawns. Their fairy tale imaginations interpreted the headstones as storybooks full of wonder. For the creatively inclined, there was death photography, an art form that brought realism to a new level. Families would gather around the deceased, posed as though the dearly beloved had simply dozed off in the throes of an enlivening novel by Dickens. These tableaux served as memento mori, a sweet reminiscence to gaze upon during afternoon tea, as chat veered from the quality of today's roast to the questionable ethics of stealing biscuits from the widow Prudence. And then there was the hottest social event of the day: a funeral. Hearses drawn by ominously regal horses clopped through town, plying streets with something akin to pomp and circumstance. The hallway chatter in elegantly distressed terraces would follow, whispering tales of Uncle Theodore's socks slipping just so during the procession, reminding everyone that gravity shows no favoritism. Yet, there was a surprising comfort in these rituals. Death was so interwoven with daily life that one learned quickly to both respect and jest with it. After all, laughter was far easier to bear than grief, especially when a stiff upper lip was expected to endure through trying times, or when the moist London air caused one's moustache to resemble a sorrowful soup strainer. Such was the landscape upon which the Victorian family craftily found balance, acknowledging death's indisputable place while cultivating the wit to deal with its peculiarities, the kind of wit that can unknowingly drift into sleep, as soothing as a lullaby, softly whisking the heavy eyelids of an industrious age. As the embers of our narrative flicker, imagine the gentle sound of a clock ticking, a Victorian timekeeper's sotto voce symphony, for it leads us forward seamlessly into more chapters of history's gentle absurdities, paving the way for deeper dreams and, perhaps, a chuckle or two along the way. Once upon a time in the Victorian era, a period renowned for its love of grandeur, rigid morals, and, oddly enough, a peculiar fascination with mortality, the fine residents of Great Britain found themselves living intimately with death, or perhaps we should say, cohabiting. Yes, imagine trying to enjoy your morning crumpet while hallway decor might include a portrait of Great Uncle Barnaby, forever captured in his teakwood coffin. It was not just the living who shared vital floor space, but the dearly departed as well, in spirit and in somewhat eerie tributes. You see, the Victorians were a curious lot, perpetually oscillating between the oppressive demands of social decorum and a wholehearted embrace of life's mysteries, with death proving to be the most enigmatic one of all. Mourning wasn't just a fleeting moment of sadness, it was a full-on social parade, with rules, regulations, and plenty of lace involved. Dresses of black and crepe-draped women fluttered about, turning towns into temporary rain clouds. Mourning wasn't merely a state. Oh no, it was a lifestyle choice, with its own evolving fashions and protocols. Picture the quintessential Victorian parlour, a room filled with velvet drapes, wood-panelled walls, and an assortment of knickknacks teetering precariously on every surface. In such rooms, families often held wakes to bid farewell to their loved ones, right there on the dining room table, mind you. It was a mixture of solemnity and shared community that somehow merged grief and socialization seamlessly, like tea and crumpets at a funeral potluck. While the living continued their routines, the dead were never truly forgotten, commemorated in special ways within the home. The Victorians had quite a penchant for memento mori, crafting eerie yet oddly touching reminders of mortality. Imagine, if you will, a dainty brooch that you might wear upon your collar. Embedded in this accessory are strands of a loved one's hair, woven into intricate patterns like macabre finger painting with a personal touch. This piece of wearable art would spark a quiet moment of reflection as the wearer sipped their tea, struggling not to accidentally dunk their grief-laden jewel into their Earl Grey. But perhaps more peculiar were the photographs. Oh, the photographs. These were no ordinary family pictures. Victorian families often posed with their deceased relatives, propping them up as if still vibrant and full of life. Photographers were tasked with artistry to add a dash of rosiness to a corpse's pallor and prop open eyes to portray a lively presence, however fleeting. It's one surefire way to ensure you are ready for your close-up at any moment. Imagine the children, taught to smile next to somber Aunt Mildred, immortalized forever as a whimsically creepy postcard of familial affection. All this may sound a bit dreary, but the Victorians found comfort in these practices, weaving a rich tapestry of memories and memorials that would carry on through generations. Mourning was an art form, a blend of tragedy and tradition, where you could both lament a loss and perhaps compete with your neighbor for the most elegant display of bereavement. These customs transform death from the final act into an ongoing legacy, offering solace and structural chaos in equal measure. As you settle deeper into your pillow, drifting further from the chitter-chatter of mortal concerns, know that these historical anecdotes of a time gone by are just shadows on the wall of history's grand parlour. With a gentle nudge from a bygone era, let your own thoughts float gently away. And if you ponder what next facet of Victorian life we will gently unwrap, something both quaint and comically peculiar awaits just beyond the horizon. So for now, breathe deeply and keep the quirks of history close, like a whispered promise of a cozy night's rest. Ah, the Victorians, a society that truly knew how to turn life's somber inevitabilities into a daily theatrical production. As we tiptoe through the austere halls of their parlours and mortuaries, we unearth the delicate dance between life and death that this melodramatic era embraced with a peculiar fondness. Let's dim the gas lamps and slip silently into the living room, or perhaps we should call it the dying room, given its dual purpose during that time. Mortality, you see, was not a hush-hush affair that hid behind closed doors in Victorian England. Instead, it was paraded with a curious blend of propriety and showmanship that would make even the most devoted soap opera fan arch an eyebrow in appreciation. In this period, death was a family affair, an event woven seamlessly into the tapestry of daily life. Funeral fashion was not just a dictum, it was something of an art form. Mourning attire required precision, an ensemble of soot-black crinolines and crepes, accessorized with jewelry crafted from the dearly departed's own hair. Imagine Aunt Mildred, her coiffured locks now adorning your necklace, a quirky Victorian's version of Forever in Our Hearts. The rituals did not end with fashion, however. The family parlour, often the centerpiece of a Victorian home, served a dual purpose, hosting grand parties and, quite candidly, the viewing of a deceased relative. The parlour, a place where laughter and tears mingled, was a testament to the Victorians' unapologetic embrace of the circle of life, with death simply being a guest with no invitation required. With a homecoming party fit for a monarch, the deceased would be laid out, peacefully slumbering in an open casket, adorned with all manners of floral arrangements that, in a fortuitous twist, doubled as natural air fresheners. An array of light refreshments often graced the somber gathering, because nothing says, "Remember the dead," quite like cucumber sandwiches and a piping hot cup of Earl Grey. As the patriarch or matriarch of the family lay in repose, songs were sung, tales were 18 told, and a parade of neighbours would file through, offering condolences and praising the departed's prowess in everything from garden pruning to amateur pre-industrial revolution electricity lectures, of which they were quite the authority, for better or worse. The children, not ones to miss out on such a grand affair, were also part of this choreography of grief. Dressed impeccably, they witnessed it all, learning at a tender age how to nod with gravity and accept a copious amount of sweets as tribute to their recently deceased relation. It was as if, by exposing their tender minds to the rituals of grief, the Victorians were planting the seeds of resilience, not to mention an acute understanding of embroidery terminology. Amidst all this sympathetic solemnity, calling cards were everywhere. If Instagram had been invented in the 19th century, it would have been a fine way for one to let the world know of their in-mourning status. Instead, the Victorians had black-edged calling, AU cards. A glimpse of these cards, angular and heavy in the palm, signalled to friends and acquaintances that one was partaking in the grand societal ritual of mourning, a nod to the era's robust affinity for symbolically charged gestures. While this devotion to deathly decorum might sound grim, it also unfolded amidst the quaintness of daily life. The ticking of the grandfather clock, the sharp needle of knitting clicking quietly in the corner, and the subtle aroma of a freshly baked Victoria sponge cake wafting through the home. All combined in a harmony of melancholy normalcy, making every visit to the parlour, whether for living or visiting, a chapter in the Victorian novel of life. And so, as we quietly close the shutters of this particular scene, and let the crackling of the coal fire lull us, we are reminded that while the Victorians may have turned mourning into a public event, they also taught us something about resilience and community. As whimsical as their expressions of it may have seemed, breathing in the gentle rhythms of the past, we drift further into the soothing folds of history, ready to explore the curious corridors time has yet to unfold. In the dimly lit parlours of Victorian England, where curtains often seemed heavier than the clouds overhead and fireplaces were perpetually on vacation, one could find the peculiar phenomenon of middle-class families living cheek by jowl with relatives who had taken up a lifelong, or should we say, afterlife, membership in the society of the perpetually still and silent. These weren't just any house guests. They were the dearly departed, lounging in their caskets like VIP patrons of an exceedingly exclusive club. Picture, if you will, Aunt Mildred. In life, she had a penchant for embroidery and as many novels as her pocket-sized spectacles could manage. In death, she occupied the corner of the drawing room, where she continued to hold court, albeit with a distinctly more wooden demeanor. The fashions dictated she remain at home for a spell, typically a week, before the grand exit, escorted by equally somber pallbearers flanked by Victorian era's finest plumes. For the living, this arrangement demanded quite the sense of humor and a reservoir of patience. Children tiptoed around with hastily stifled giggles, convinced Aunt Mildred's spirit might pop out at any moment to remind them of their posture. Adults, on the other hand, were often found having profound conversations with themselves at the tea table, occasionally addressing both the present company and the silence of the grave in the same breath. Here, we find a classic intersection of Victorian morbidity and practicality, fueled by a tight-knit family structure and economic concerns. You see, in a world where travel arrangements rivaled the complexity of deciphering tea leaves, a relative's demise called for a prolonged stay at the family abode. Undertakers were booked, photographs taken post-mortem. We'll save that unsettling chat for a more wakeful moment, and the beloved Newtonian laws of physics were anticipated to wait a bit longer before claiming the dearly beloved for a final descent beneath the sod. There was, too, a thematic consistency to these arrangements which would awe even the most meticulous wedding planner. Black was emphatically in, marking the attire choices for the mourners, while grief expressed was an affair for the guest registers, offered with robust Victorian sincerity. Families formed a lovely tableau vivant, with somber glances and tear-stained chins that alternated the essence of stoic British resolve with Gothic drama worthy of a Bronte novel. Despite the apparent somberness, there was an oddly comforting order to this picture. Families were united in their eclectic, prolonged goodbyes, blending rituals of the past with their peculiar brand of emotional resilience. Meanwhile, Aunt Mildred's earthly presence served as a timely reminder that life was less a sprint and more a poetic shuffle through the rolling fogs of time, where the everyday had its own unhurried charm. But as dawn's gentle fingers crept over cobblestone, families slowly turned the page, easing into their routines and letting memory find a warm nest in their hearts. With each passing hour, Aunt Mildred's departure became part of a cherished tapestry of stories told by the fire, an eternal presence now exclusive to the world of whispers and dreams. And so, as we must, we'll leave these souls to their quiet reveries, their histories etched into the hearthstones of their homes. Perhaps the next tale in this winding, restful journey will carry us further into the ticking of Victorian clocks or the soft rustle of lace curtains. Like misty footnotes cascading into the horizon, their stories continue, reminding us that even in the stillness of sleep, time travels with us, inching us ever closer to dawn. During the Victorian era, afternoon tea wasn't just an excuse to consume alarming amounts of finger sandwiches. It was also a clever Victorian strategy to mingle amongst the living and the, well, slightly less living. Picture, if you will, a drawing room adorned with elegant lace doilies, where the living room's aesthetic almost mirrored the stillness of a staid mausoleum. Oh, how the Victorians loved to entertain death right there within the home's creaky, comfortable confines. They'd place the dearly departed right in the drawing room for a posthumous social soiree. Nothing says, keep calm and carry on, quite like a corpsely conversation piece surrounded by bone china and buttered crumpets. As you may chuckle quietly to yourself under the hum of the setting sun, try to imagine how the Victorian household managed these morbidly merry occasions. Sending out invitations to Auntie's final hurrah was as normal as planning the annual garden fete. Families were where the word wake had less to do with rousing from sleep and more to do with hoping old Uncle Edgar didn't accidentally disturb the throw pillows upon his grand exit. In this era of close living with the afterlife, even photography had its ghoulish charms. Families would hire photographers for a seance-led photo op, posing their dearly departed as if they were merely taking a languid afternoon nap, perhaps with their favorite book, so as not to appear impolite. And if you'll allow a brief visual diversion, these photographs are still studied today by historians and sartorially somber Instagrammers as a peculiar brand of memento mori, a gentle reminder of mortality captured forever on album and paper. But let's not get carried away contemplating our own mortality's timeline. Back to the calm comedies of Victorian domesticity. While having the deceased in one's own parlour was quite the norm, households were equally devoted to the much livelier art of superstition. Victorians believed that the spirit world operated on a very particular set of house rules. Mirrors were to be covered lest they inadvertently trap a soul. Heaven forbid you might end up with anything but your reflection smiling back at you. And clocks, ever obliging with their tick-tocking punctuation, were stopped at the moment of death to avoid any spectral confusion about the proper time to move on, lest the spirit decide to loiter past its bedtime. Meanwhile, dinner still went on in the dining room, regardless of any posthumous guests in attendance. Victorians had their priorities. Everyone knows a good roast beef waits for no man. One must keep up one's strength after all, especially given the rigors of back-to-back funerals and family ghost stories by the hearthside. Bustling affairs often narrated by the living with technical accuracy only they could truly appreciate. So it was in these Victorian homes where life's great play was presented in multiple acts, all under one familiar and, might I add, overly wallpapered roof. Rooms were swiftly reorganized into waking parlors, their air mingling seamlessly with the aroma of rosewater and the tangible weight of stiff upper lips. The no-nonsense rule applied here. Living, mourning, hosting, and occasionally fainting from an ill-timed bout of Gothic-style melodrama were all part of the day's work. Perhaps as you drift in and out of recognition, you might sense that familiar connection with your own cozy corner of the universe, knowing that some uniquely Victorian part of us all endures. Take solace, dear listener, that as night gently unfolds its inky blanket under the watchful gaze of the moon, we too share in the tender dance of dream and memory, acknowledging both living moments and those briefly lived beyond our touch. May you too find your place, restful and undisturbed, with comforting dreams wrapped snugly in night's embrace as we slowly turn the chapter and drift quietly into the next soothing segment of our story. Rest easy, dear traveller, for there are more enchanting details ahead, although the night's whispers ask you first to surrender peacefully to sleep's gentle beckon. Imagine, if you will, the soft glow of a gaslight flickering in the corner of a Victorian parlour. The air is thick with the scent of lavender and camphor, and quiet conversations weave a delicate tapestry of whispers against a backdrop of a ticking grandfather clock. This isn't just any room. It's a Victorian drawing room in mourning attire. Yet again, it seems Victorian families and death were old friends, nodding acquaintances at least. Today, we're delicately peeling back the curtain on the peculiar yet strangely comforting habits of having death as a houseguest more frequently than a dodgy cousin. In the Victorian household, a family member's passing was as cyclic and predictable as a rainy London afternoon. With the lack of modern medicine, life cycle consisted of a bit too much departure, with an insane sense of stiff upper lipping through one's handkerchief. Ah, you see, mourning wasn't just a somber affair. It was a spectacular, well-orchestrated charade, complete with all the theatrics of a Sunday matinee, minus the cheering audience. Once the last breath escaped one's loved one, the aficionado of the deceased, a title no one ever fought for, swiftly transformed the parlor into a stage, readying it to host the resting guest of honor. Mirrors were shrouded in black crepe, not simply because Victorians were fashion-forward, but because, according to legend, mirrors, those mystical contraptions, could trap a soul and give it an unplanned encore. We can't have Great Uncle Albert popping back when we're in the middle of a cozy evening with Charles Dickens's latest melodrama. Now, no Victorian tale would be complete without the obligatory photograph of the dearly departed, a most peculiar antiquity of asking someone to hold that pose eternally. This substitute for bidding a black-bordered farewell was a snapshot into the stillness of their new, albeit subdued reality. Families huddled close for these solemn mementos, as if squished family photos would somehow comfortably tweet to later generations. Yes, we were bonded in both love and rigor mortis. Family goals, 1879. And the mourning attire. One can't embark on the journey to the afterlife without wardrobe considerations. Black crepe was the fabric du jour, embodying every nuance of gloom, which is as close to a scene of a tragic play as one could muster. It's fashion, darling, and death was remarkably in style. But wait, there was an unwritten rulebook of color etiquette too. Widows were the elite players in this sartorial concert, draped in deep mourning black with a decorum that screamed elegance and sadness mashed into one. The lengths determined not by sentimentality, but by societal decree. After all, community approval was the most reliable validation a person could flaunt. The signage of mourning also extended to dear old Mr. Tweedle, the household pet who had lost his will to bark as hearts beat their subdued rhythms. Even the clock would halt its persistent tick, tacitly agreeing to pause time in honor of the house's solemn hush. The clock's morning nap symbolized that not even time could heal all wounds, because time too needed to lick its burial wounds. However, the grand finale of this somber production would be the post-mortem tea party, a celebration of life over steaming cups of Earl Grey and scones, because in Britain, rising from the dead might be doubtful, but the resurrection of your craving for a biscuit was almost certain. Though laughter might have been subdued, undercurrents of joy slipped slyly through the social decorum, a reminder that life's continuity lay gently within the delicate clinking of teacups. It was the strangest of paradoxes, really. While death resided indiscriminately, life churned onwards within the confines of rigmarole, like a ship amid a foggy harbour, illuminated dimly though assuredly along its steadfast path. As the last embers of the hearth flicker, dimming their light beneath a half-moon wink, we gently tread onward, ready to uncover yet another facet of these Victorian spectacles. Breathe deeply, for the shadows transform into dreams, and through them we sail toward the whispers of another captivating subject, as the soft glow of candlelight flickered against the wallpapered walls of Victorian homes. Weary British families were cosily reminded of their one rather peculiar houseguest who never seemed to take the hint and leave: death. Not that death was necessarily partaking in afternoon tea or heartily engaged in a rousing game of charades. Rather, it became a permanent, albeit somewhat awkward, resident in the form of mourning customs so elaborate that they could rival the Queen Victoria herself, should she have placed a calling card on their dusty mantle. During Victorian times, when mortality rates were high, especially among children, and life insurance was not quite the reassuring shield it is today, families lived side by side with sorrow, wearing their grief much like a grandaunt's cherished brooch. The morbidly fashionable black attire, a stark contrast to the era's usual vibrant patterned clothing, was more than just a statement. It was a lifestyle choice that screamed prosperity if you managed to pull it off with elegance and flair. Because who knew mourning could be chic? In a living room otherwise cluttered with an excessive number of floral patterns, as if competing with a small botanical garden, Victorians turned their parlours into temporary shrines. Most folks could expect at least 1 or 2 rooms to be dominated by mourning duties. Heavy black crepe draperies cloaked mirrors. That was presumably less about reflecting gloomy moods and more about keeping unwelcome spirits at bay, lest the dearly departed decide to practice their ghostly jazz hands. Every family member had their role in these lugubrious theatrics. Widows held the starring position, mourning the longest, and adorned in outfits that astonished the local pigeons who wondered if the corvids in town had decided to go haute couture. Children were sometimes given the role of cherubic memoriam, yet they often preferred tearing around the house like little bundles of unsuppressed energy, occasionally questioning why Uncle Albert had decided to nap in the nicest box they'd ever seen. Death, however, did prompt some innovative solutions to novel problems. For one, the Victorians were pioneering enough to come up with a contraption known as the coffin torpedo, a booby-trapped casket that ensured one's eternal rest remained remarkably uninterrupted by those with unsavory interests in afterlife entrepreneurship. Grave robbers. With such ingenuity, it seems only fitting that one's passage to the hereafter was accompanied by subtle pyrotechnics, adding a touch of thrilling drama that any Gothic narrative would envy. In a curious practice, mourning jewelry enshrined a loved one's memory with locks of hair woven discreetly into brooches or rings, forever bearing the essence of the departed. Should one peer a little too closely at an elegant neighbor's cameo, they might discover a silhouette held together by Great-Aunt Mildred's illustrious curls. Who said breakfast banter couldn't be thrilling when you had a literal part of history sitting next to the sugar spoon? Meals, too. Adopted symptoms of mourning. In periods marked by grief, one often found themselves withheld from certain culinary pleasures. Upon losing a dear relative, a sober dining experience was preferable, avoiding celebrations of roast beef and sticking instead to something plain and simple, like broth. Presumably, this was a practical consideration lest lunchtime erupt into an emotional roller coaster, with onions aplenty. Familial gatherings became reflective rituals punctuated by the collection of memento mori photographs, capturing images not merely of the living, but also of their late beloved, achieving the ultimate Victorian avatar of peace and repose. As pictures took considerable time to capture, the family pet, one would hope, had been well trained in maintaining its model posture, or more so a stark absence thereof. And so it was that Victorians navigated life alongside death with pragmatic forbearance and a surprising flair for style and sentimentality. As they exchanged tales and infinite cups of tea, the reassurance of rituals and remembrance served not only as an acceptance of life's fleeting nature, but as a quiet testament to finding humor in the somber, perhaps knowing that bit of laughter adds a gentle charm to the uncertainty of our own infinite slumber. With a gentle, reverent chuckle lingering in the air, our journey floats on the rhythmic tide towards another tale yet untold, whispering to the dreams of the sleepless that there are always stories that invite a touch of rest and a perfect close of the eyes. As the candlelight melted into a soft, hazy glow, and the contours of the Victorian home blurred into a serene tapestry of shadows, it became apparent that this chapter would lull us into a gentle slumber. The day had given way to night, and with it came a familiar calm in the homes of the late 19th century. Ah, the Victorian era, when houses were not just homes, but also inadvertent custodians of mortality. In this serene chapter, we find ourselves tiptoeing through a typical Victorian sitting room, though perhaps sitting is generous, as no one seemed to sit still for long in this era of ghost-chasing hobbies and spirit-rousing parlours. Here, families gathered not just to sit amidst the ticking of grandfather clocks, but to contemplate the eternal and the ever-so-slightly macabre. Take, for example, the art of post-mortem photography, a practice where the dearly departed were dressed in their Sunday and their best, sometimes posed as if they were merely caught in a moment of rest. Lenses captured their likeness, often surrounded by the living, in a frozen family gathering that one might blissfully mistake for a peculiar wax museum portrait. One might wonder what prompted such a practice. Was it a practical strategy to ensure one's inheritance was dependent only on the living? Or a gentle attempt to soften the starkness of absence with a photograph that whispered, "See, I'm still here with you, just a little quieter"? These portraits were tucked into albums, somber confidants to the living's reminiscence, testimony to a time when death lingered comfortably at home, rather than being whisked away out of sight. Naturally, there was a certain societal flair in how one embraced the inevitable. Black crepe fabric adorned doorways, windows draped to inform the neighborhood of bereavement. The more elaborate the mourning attire, the deeper the societal nods of approbation. It was quite a sight. Victorians had two skills in spades: inventing gadgets and inventing elaborate rituals for things that didn't require it. Not to be left out were the mourning accoutrements, jewelry crafted intricately with the hair of the deceased, woven with the same delicacy as the memories enshrined in hearts. Wearing a braided keepsake around one's wrist or neck was not just a fashion statement. It was a statement that you had diligently completed all 18 steps of the 24-month mourning schedule, a feat truly worth of solemnity. Even the furniture played its part. Grandfather clocks often bore witness to the final breath. Not just metaphors for the passage of time, they literally stopped. Families choosing to cease the ticking when death was imminent. These foundational timekeepers of a household's rhythm might have secretly sighed into silence, waiting for the inevitable reset some months later. And as daylight diffused into moonlit shadow, the Victorian home's hearth became a sanctuary for reflection. Sometimes it was the echo of those who'd passed that filled the rooms, a favorite chair squeaking, a book reeling back into its rack just so. Was it the wind, or was it Grandfather Horace expressing his approval over the latest installment of a serial novel? The Victorians certainly hoped so, given their penchant for spiritualist gatherings and séances as casual Thursday afternoon entertainment. Thus, with the essence of a bygone age nestling warmly into your mind like the soft folds of a thick blanket, we bid farewell, not just to Victorian homes, but to their loving, if a touch melodramatic, relationship with the great beyond. Their stories and idiosyncrasies, carried through time like a comforting lullaby, sing us gently to rest. May your dreams be as vivid as a Victorian family portrait, and as you slide into slumber, remember to carry a hint of this history, humor, and the gentle curiosity that makes time travel through tales the very essence of a good night's sleep. We've reached the end of our journey, dear listener. Drift softly into the arms of sleep, nestled snugly in the history's gentle embrace. Sweet dreams.